Now, this is one of those times in history, or people in history, which when you look at them, when you really start to consider what they were doing and what they were thinking, what they were talking about, they are products, indubitably, of the system they were in. And in fact, Scheer is such a product of the system that he's in that before I really can get into talking about him, before I can really talk about Admiral Scheer and his personality, I have to talk about Germany's answer to the wrong question. I have to talk about German strategy in going into World War I, their naval strategy, because, you see, there is a running theme in history of strategies made by powers who know they are not as strong as other powers to deal with them, which are basically based around the idea this other power must conform to what I want because that's the only way I can win against them. This power must do what I want them to do. It can only respond by doing one thing, and German's naval strategy going into World War I can be summed up by Scheer's own quote. It literally can be summed up by a quote, quite a famous quote amongst naval historians, of Scheer from from his studies before and after World War I, from his work. There was only one opinion amongst us, from the commander-in-chief down to the latest recruit, about the attitude of the English fleet. We are convinced that it would seek out and attack our fleet the minute it showed itself and wherever it was. In other words, they had convinced themselves so much, based on their reading of the history of the Royal Navy, on their exercises of the Royal Navy, on their interpretation of what the Royal Navy's actions had been in the past, that the Royal Navy would be unquestioningly aggressive, and therefore would charge them the moment war was declared, would inevitably try to inflict upon them a close blockade. A close blockade which would allow the Germans to attrit the forces using submarines, mines, and their large torpedo boats, their equivalent of destroyers. And it would be a close blockade which would be attrited and which could eventually they could bring to battle, and any battle would be closer to the German shores so that any ship which was damaged would be far more likely, if it was a German ship, to be able to be repaired because it'd be able to get home to port more likely than British ships would be harried across the North Sea and therefore would be sunk by either the sea or the German action, etc., and would inevitably attrit even more the British more. And by doing that, the Germans could make up for their disadvantage in numbers and infrastructure. By doing that, they could wipe out the British advantage. The only problem was, this is basically the same strategy as France developed with the Igenohl. Okay, the idea was, using torpedo boats and all these other things, the enemy fleet will come on here, get annihilated, and then our cruisers can dominate the world. Okay, the Japanese in World War II have a similar strategy and develop a similar strategy based on their experience with the Russians, which is anyone who comes to us, we will attrit and then we will fight when we are on equivalent terms. And to an extent, the Japanese can expect that because they are an island in the Pacific, and everyone, if they want to fight them, has to actually go to them. They have to go to them. Germany forgot one small problem. France at least has the Mediterranean coast. France at least theoretically has the Atlantic coast. Britain literally sits astride every single access point of Germany to the open sea, to the global trade. And whilst, yes, a close blockade is the most effective form of blockade, and if the British had been able to break into the Baltic and inflict a blockade there, they would have done so. But you're presuming the British are going to play stupid. You're presuming the British aren't going to adapt yourself to it. And the thing is, the German Navy built their vessels around the idea of this operation turning out this way. To an extent, they defined the useful ranges and the operational capabilities of their vessels by that scenario. They developed everything around this one scenario. And that's a problem. That's turning your fleet willfully into a one-trick pony. Into a fleet which cannot be easily rebalanced to face the coming threat, to face the changing scenario. And what's worse with this strategy is that the people you've trained up in it have been so inoculated to think about what they think the British would behave like, that the best examples of it, and Scheer is handpicked by both Tirpitz and Holzendorff. So, my lord, this man is handpicked by the senior officers of the Kaiserliche Marine. He is a hand-picked benefactor of them, and he is one of their candidates who goes the whole way up. Their reaction is to try and out-English the English, or rather out-British the British. But they're actually trying to out-British. It's going to sound strange. They're trying to out their perception of the British, their perception of the British. They're not actually playing the British. They are fighting against their perception of the British. And that is a very different scenario. They are fighting against their perception of the Royal Navy. And to an extent, yes, BT plays into that. BT certainly lives up to this desire of aggression, etc., and portrays himself as such. But honestly, some of these officers had actually met Jellicoe, had met Fisher, had met the other senior officers of the Royal Navy. They knew them, and yet they never really saw them. And that's a problem. Because, as I've discussed before in the Building the Fleets of Jutland video, the Germans have a problem with the fleet they have to construct. They have to make all sorts of compromises to try and get out that fleet, let alone a balanced fleet. They don't get a balanced fleet, they get out that fleet, which is horrendously imbalanced. And one of the reasons it's imbalanced is because of the compromises made, which are based on this analysis. Based on this analysis. They cause themselves real trouble. They really do. And Scheer is probably the biggest example of this. He really is. Now, one of the best sources we have for the life of Reinhard Scheer, of Carl Friedrich Heinrich Reinhard Scheer. That's a mouthful. Try saying that without a drink of Iron Brew. I still don't have any sponsorships of my videos. I think quite a lot of sponsors might presume I'm sponsored by Iron Brew, but I'm not. I wish I was. It would make my life a lot cheaper. But anyway, leaving that to one side. Scheer is unremarkable. In fact, he's about as average as you get, initially. If you look at his career in the German Navy, especially as a cadet, he comes from a middle-class background. Whilst he does well in the practical parts of his cruise aboard Niobe and various other duties, and later on he will command a flotilla of torpedo boats from another vessel, a Gazelle-class Niobe. But this was the sail frigate Niobe from 1849 he was on, which was 1879. He joined at the age of 15. So he's born in 1863, September 1863. He is satisfactory, but not brilliant. In fact, that's often the recording. He is satisfactory. He gets the second highest grade in his class the following year, but at the beginning and for much of his career, he rates satisfactory. Following his graduation from naval school and after his, of course, tour on Niobe, he spends 6 months in, as is normal, the Special Training Program for Gunnery, Torpedo Warfare, and Infantry. Yes, the Kaiserliche Marine has its priority. Gunnery, torpedoes, and infantry. But, again, this is a Navy which is expanding. This is a Navy which, if you think about it, when he joins in 1879, is on the cusp of starting his expansion program, which will eventually take it to being the second largest Navy in the world. But at this point, in 1879, it is certainly not the second largest Navy in the world. In fact, it's as far from the second largest Navy in the world as you can possibly imagine. Then he gets, after all this work, and he does quite well. Okay? He's nothing spectacular. He really isn't spectacular. After this, he starts to get deployed on the frigates. And please note, I'm not going to be exhaustive about all the courses and everything he goes on, because they're the average career. He really is a bit of an average career, but there are some things it's worthwhile pointing out to. The frigate years, when he always seems to be almost always going onto a frigate. Yes, he does actually in this time also spend some time on the Hertha, which is, there is a debate as to whether it's a frigate or a corvette. It's certainly called a corvette by some sources, but others have referred to it as a frigate, and I think that probably comes from the whole translation issues occasionally, but also some of the discussion. So I've called it the frigate years, but the Hertha technically is probably a corvette, but there are some sources calling it a frigate. But his time on the Friedrich Karl, his time on the Hertha, these are useful vessels. These are capable vessels that he learns his career on. But realistically, the biggest opportunity for him, and the most important opportunity for him, comes when he's aboard the Bismarck. And that's when he starts to befriend future senior officers. Specifically, he's a lieutenant, a very junior one, and he is promoted to serve on the Bismarck. And he gets Henning von Holzendorff as a senior lieutenant aboard the Bismarck. And Henning is a future star. I've done videos about Henning von Holzendorff. He's the forgotten German admiral of World War I in so many ways. He's critical to the developments of the Navy. He's critical to the strategy of the Navy. And in many regards, he is the Fisher to Scheer's Jellicoe. Now, I'm pleased that I'm saying in many regards, not in total regards, because there's more fun when it comes to Scheer. He gets more than just one benefactor, but the advantage for him, the capabilities for him are great. As Holzendorff already has a reputation by that point, and we are talking 1886, 1884, sort of 1886, Holzendorff already has a lot of respect amongst the wider service. You know Holzendorff is going on to greatness. And if he's decided you're a pretty smart gentleman who he's going to work with, who he's putting into his following, then you know you're dealing with a fairly smart cookie. So what have they made them see this idea in Scheer, who up to this point has been satisfactory, unremarkable, and second place? What is coming through? Well, he leads a landing party that suppressed a pro-British indigenous chieftain in Cameroon in December 1884, actually. He does a lot of various little duties. And the thing is, he's seen as a problem solver. He's seen as innately aggressive, but also a capable problem solver who's going to approach problems. and deal them. If you're starting to notice similarities and why it makes sense actually, now it's happened, to do both him and Jellicoe in the same week, thank you. In many ways, these two videos are the two sides of a similar coin. Of a very similar coin. But I'd say the difference is this, and I'll be talking about this as we go through it. Whereas Jellicoe seems to have a pretty darn accurate understanding of the German Navy, of the Kaiserliche Marine, and the situation it's in, Scheer never seems to have the same understanding of the Royal Navy. He gets insights, don't get me wrong, he gets insights. But there always seems to be a misunderstanding, and I think that misunderstanding comes from the fact that the only officer who really in this period of the German side who ever actually successfully put themselves in the mindset of the British was Holzendorff. And others tried to ape him, but they don't actually ever achieve it. Holzendorff is the only one who ever seems to have a very good understanding of the Royal Navy from his papers at the time. And having read the papers of both organizations and both navies and had lots and lots of discussions with some very, very smart people looking into their papers. Because they specialized in that topic. I don't, but they did, and it was worthwhile. I was always happy to be a sounding board, and still am happy to be a sounding board for them. The thing I learned, and I have learned over and over again, is that aggression they are expecting out from the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy's always had a reputation of aggression. But it seems to me that for some reason, whereas the French had understood it was calculated aggression, and to an extent the Russians thought it was faked aggression, the Germans always felt it was just aggression, that the Royal Navy would be just aggressive. And it's kind of weird because for most of their history, Germany or Prussia before it, etc., had been, for a large part of their history, in this period, had been the British allies. They'd fought alongside them. But maybe that's why they didn't understand it. Maybe they were reading their own answer to the question into what their ally was doing, presuming on similarity because they were an ally. Which is a plausible argument to make, very difficult to substantiate, very difficult to prove or put in a book, so I can't really make that case. But I can put this idea in this video here and you can think about it. And I hope you do, because most of these videos, what they are about is trying to make people enjoy naval history, hopefully, but also hopefully encourage people to think about naval history. And this is the thing. After he's done his time with Holzendorff, he then goes on to various other duties. And those other duties include working with Tirpitz. Yes. Tirpitz. While he is running a torpedo unit, while he is running a torpedo research command and working in Kiel and doing various things, he actually makes a very strong reputation for himself as a torpedo specialist, rather than a gunnery specialist, a torpedo specialist. And he meets Tirpitz, and Tirpitz really likes him. And that's one of the reasons why he transfers him. When Tirpitz gets promoted to the State Secretary of the Imperial Navy, and gets given that role, he takes Scheer to the Reichsmarinat, the RMA, to work in the torpedo section, to work in developing torpedo doctrine for the Kaiserlich Marine. So, he's got Holzendorff on his side, and he's got Tirpitz on his side. Now, these are two senior officers that, as I've discussed before, have a habit of disagreeing vehemently. I mean, it's like if you're one of those few officers who has both Fisher and Beresford backing you up. If you have both Fisher and Beresford on your side, wow, you must be spectacular. I can name the officers, well, I can number the officers who had Fisher and Beresford or both on the same side on literally 3 fingers. Tirpitz and Holzendorff, there's like 2. 2 they both agree that are good officers. Scheer is one of them. Unsurprisingly, in a rapidly expanding navy with a lot of issues going on in terms of its political capabilities and its desire to prove itself whilst on a shoestring budget, someone who can problem solve, who's considered intelligent and aggressive, and who has the backing of 2 of the biggest personalities in the Navy, well, he kind of finds his promotion path pretty clear. I mean, it's amazing. He really does find his promotion path gets cleared quite well. It's so unexpected. No one would believe this would happen. But there's also the other problem for this. In many ways, Scheer is such a good student of Tirpitz, of Holzendorff, that when I look at his own analysis and his own plans for how to act on things, his own strategies, I see Holzendorff and Tirpitz. I see him trying to marry the two and their two perspectives. I see him trying to find a solution in every plan between their own ideas. And whilst I do agree, those are the two strategists, the construction strategist and the operational strategist of the Kaiserlich Marine, of the German Navy at the time, I think that, honestly, neither of them are necessarily the right strategist for what Germany finds itself in, a situation Germany finds itself in. Or rather, Holzendorff is certainly the one where my sympathies lie, because I think his thought process was a lot better on a strategic level, but I think when it comes to an operational doctrine for the Kaiserlich Marine at this point, the Kaiserlich Marine was sorely lacking. It needed a strategic operational doctrine which accounted for the scenario where the enemy did not play ball with your primary operational standard plan, and there hadn't been enough thought applied to that at all. And whilst you can go things, well, they're busy and they're dealing with all the pressures of command, all these things. Literally, you're a senior officer, and this is brain work. This is thinking, what happens if my first option doesn't work? What happens if my best option doesn't take place? And if you're not thinking that enough, that you have a fully formed out doctrine for what goes wrong, what you do if everything goes wrong, then you aren't doing your jobs. You really aren't. And there are so many things with the Royal Navy. There are really a lot of things wrong with the British Royal Navy. But one thing you can say, looking at the performance in World War I and World War II, in this time period, they always had a plan for if their first plan failed. They always had backup options. It might not be apparently written down, but they always had it worked out, at least on a theoretical discursive level, so they could enact it. And they did. Did the second option always go to plan? No. Then they'd have a third option and a fourth option. But they had the options. The Kaiserlich Marine seems to not be good at giving itself on more options. Now, there are limitations in their force structure, which mean they have a limited number of options they can actually implement, so I can understand it to an extent, but I still can't forgive it. And it comes from Holzendorff and Tirpitz. It comes from those personalities and their approach to things. But the trouble is that then means that their best student, their promising hope, who exemplifies all they believe the Kaiserlich Marine needs, well, yeah. And here's the really cruel thing for poor Scheer. He gets to command 2 ships in his career. 2 ships, realistically. There is the Sophie as well, which he sort of gets to do some things on while he's a torpedo officer, but he doesn't really get much time in command of her. And there are the vessels including the Niobe at the torpedo research place. But again, he's got other duties while he's doing that, so he doesn't really get much fun in charge of those. He gets a little bit of fun, but not much, and it's literally April to June 1901 and February to July 1902 he actually gets a light cruiser to serve on and command in that role. Why? Because almost as soon as he's done a 2-year command on the Alsace, which is the ship at the top, a battleship for 2 years, he is called up, recommended for promotion, and becomes the Chief of Staff to the then commanding officer of the High Seas Fleet. One Admiral Holzendorff. He was promoted to Rear Admiral 6 months after taking the post, achieving that position at the age of 47. And he would hold the Chief of Staff position until 1911, when he's transferred back to the Reichsmarine the RMA, to work under Tirpitz, where he gets the post of Chief of the General Naval Department, which he holds the role until 1912. And from that point on, he goes on to become Squadron Commander for the battleships of the 2nd Battleship Squadron of the High Seas Fleet. In simple terms, he got to command 2 ships. 2 ships. And yes, he's bright. Yes, he's a useful problem solver. Yes, he's a useful asset. Yes, he's demonstrated himself in leading small units and being a leader under others and working with strong personalities. But he hasn't really had much a chance to really develop his own leadership style. And in some regards, Jellicoe, who had, of course, been nicked off to be a flag captain, more often than not, had actually had more opportunities to command, even with his limited command time, than Scheer did. Because Scheer spends most of his time as a senior officer right until between squadron command of battleships and being a captain of a battleship as Chief of Staff and an administrative officer. And yes, you've got an expanding navy. Yes, you need these skilled people to doing these jobs. But oh Lord, are you limiting him? Especially when you want a seasoned senior officer for high command later on. In many ways, you've been using his brain power, but not allowing him to develop his skill set. And one of the things you'll also notice in this is that as important as the roles have been, as a chief of staff, as even the chief of the General Naval Department, he has been executing the vision of others. He's been informing them, advising them, assisting them, but executing the vision of others. Executing the vision of others. Now, this is again the point where you can draw comparisons with Jellicoe. You can go, well, Jellicoe was Third Sea Lord. That's a similar role to the Reichsmarinamt, the chief of the General Naval Department. It's a similar role, but in many ways, the Third Sea Lord, their role is titled Third Sea Lord and control the Navy, is pretty much god of the Royal Navy docks, and de facto, wherever they walk, they get to decide things. And as I've discussed before with the role of the Third Sea Lord, they get to present the plans to the rest of the Sea Lords, offer their recommendations as to which of the plans to select, and then once a plan is selected, they are in charge of its execution and any modifications which might be needed for the vis-a-vis of getting it into service on time and carrying it through the construction process. In other words, for that period, they're closer to the position of Tirpitz, and the position which Scheer finds himself in is closer to that role which Jellicoe served in when he was assistant to the Third Sea Lord, naval assistant to the Third Sea Lord. Especially with the way Tirpitz runs his department. And again, Chief of Staff of Holzendorff is excellent. That's theoretically a frontline role to a very senior officer, a very capable senior officer who trusts you, who thinks you're very good. But the thing is, Holzendorff also has a habit, which is not always the best habit, I will admit, of being a bit my way or the highway. And none of this is unusual for officers at the time. None of this is unusual for senior officers at the time to want this out of their juniors, but it does mean that you have issues getting independent thought, and especially if you have two strong personalities and you work for them, you've either always been in simpatico with them, if they're so impressed with you, i.e. total agreement, which is quite interesting for two such different officers to be in such perfect agreement with them, or you never argue back. And one is a lot more problematic than the other, but both are problematic from the point of view of senior command. But saying that, most navies at this time haven't had the lesson of George Tyrone. Most of them have not applied it. The Royal Navy has, because the Royal Navy had a massive embarrassment. It had lost one of its best admirals, and suffered a major embarrassment to its Mediterranean fleet, and one of its more important ships were lost, and a good crew, because people weren't exercising their own brains. But we are talking about Victorian Edwardian navies. That period of history. Think of it in British terms. Late 19th century, early 20th century fleets. Where the rule of thumb is you don't really apply your strategic brain until you're a admiral, unless you're a captain independently cruising on a international, on a sort of presence mission or maritime security mission. To be fair, though, also the German Navy at the time, this is also when they produced the German word I find the most difficult to pronounce, so enjoy. Gefechtschiffrwende. No. Gefekt Winde, which I probably just mangled completely, because I always do, it seems to be. No matter what I say it a different way every time, it seems. But that's the combat turn, the battle turn, and that, of course, works on a very interesting command principle. Because instead of you trying to time it from the front, from where the Admiral ship is, you send a signal to turn down to all the ships, and then the signal for the ships to start turning is the ship behind them is turning. So the last ship in line turns first, and then it goes up the line. And it's the quickest way to get the combat maneuver, the turn away, to work. It's a really good maneuver if executed properly, but it's a really difficult maneuver to execute properly. But anyway, shameless book plug time. So shameless book plug time. Okay, so this is the part where I go to say thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, especially for pressing that button down there, which is next to the subscribe button, and working out which exactly bell you want to see. If you want the personalised one, whether you want just occasional adverts to channel videos, or whether you want to see all the videos. Basically, how much power you want to give YouTube over what you see and what you decide to watch. Also going to say, thank you for supporting this channel. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. I know I've already said that, but I'm going to say it again. Because, yeah, I got the new computer, thanks to all you. Which has meant that I've been able to do that, because considering the car bill I've just had today, that would have, if I was literally doing it off my own income, God knows when I would have got it done. God knows when I would have been able to put it through, because, yeah, that's a big hit. Poor car. Needed new tyres and calipers. And unfortunately, as much as I could do some of the work myself, when it needs to pass its MOT and service and literally is there to do it, and I need it for tomorrow to drive to Exeter for various things, yeah, there ain't much of an option. It's got to be done. Oh, I think possibly it cost more than the car is technically worth, but it's not more than it's worth to me, because having to change, sort out a new car, everything else, yeah, I don't feel like that. I don't feel like doing that at all. That's really not a good thing to be doing right now. But thank you, everyone. Thank you. Your support makes all this possible, makes what I'm going to be doing later this week possible, makes what I'm going to be doing this year possible, makes everything for this channel, all the books which are coming out, all the things which are being done possible. It's all thanks to your support. And please note that can be just watching the videos, because honestly, watching them through helps promote them in the algorithm, helps get them to more people, helps make it up my minutes of watch minutes and all those things, which is all helpful. Those people who do super thanks and super chats, really helpful. Those people who do Ko-fi donations, helpful. But everyone is helpful. I get some comments sometimes, people not sure if they're being able to be helpful because they don't have the financial freedom to do super chats or super thanks or those things, and I go, no, if you watch the videos, that's helpful. I really do appreciate the people, trust me, I really do appreciate the people who do the financial help, and I honestly, it scares me, because I'm never sure how to say thank you and how to say thank you for all your kindness and your help, because I don't know what's adequate enough to say, really. But I appreciate everyone who watches the videos. When I see the videos get so many thousand views, etc. on this within the first 24, 48 hours, it makes me think it's worth it. It makes me think I'm providing something interesting to the people, something that people enjoy and learn from. And that's thanks to you. So thank you. Anyway, let's get back to his Time in High Command. Now, when war breaks out, when World War I breaks out, we find Scheer in command of the 2nd Battle Squadron. And, well, very soon after it breaks out, though, he gets moved to the 3rd Squadron High Seas Fleet, which was the most modern battleships they had. It really was the best of the best, and putting him in charge of them is basically a signal to the senior officers above him that, we've given him someone who is trusted by the high command, who will definitely get the job done as your senior deputy. Go engage the enemy. The trouble is, Friedrich von Igenohl, who's this gentleman, and Hugo von Pohl. One is ill, but both are realists during their time in command. Both are realists, and both really do assess the situation they're faced with. And honestly, Scheer chafes under their command. He is always pushing for raids at the British coast to lure out portions of the Royal Navy. He doesn't seem to understand the Royal Navy seems to has a policy of it's either worth all the fleets deploying or none of the fleet deploying. I.e., yes, the battlecruiser force might be deployed, especially after Scarborough raids, etc., deployed south and deploy more quickly because they're deployed forward, but the Grand Fleet will also be out. That doesn't seem to register. And we'll see that later in the Jutland scenario where he's gambling. He never seems to think, well, hang on, why is the battlecruiser fleet not accelerating away at full speed? They're going fast, yes. But why are they keeping such order and not breaking out? When they're faced with such a huge mass, why are they staying together and pulling away slowly? Not panicking and going, hang on, we've got the overwhelming might of the fleet, we're a small force, we're going to get annihilated here, we need to break and save ourselves. Never really thinks that, hang on, they could be withdrawing on something larger. Admittedly, it could be because of the lack of radio signals going from BT that he draws that inference, and we'll get that from him later. We'll discuss that later. But pretty much, he feels the whole time that Igenohl is overcautious, and he feels that von Pohl was exceedingly cautious, conducting only 5 of which ineffective fleet actions in von Pohl's time, which remained within 120 nautical miles of German territory. Blucher, of course, the loss of the Blucher had caused the removal of Igenohl, which is kind of harsh because he wasn't even there. And the fact that they got away from Dogger Bank with only losing the Blucher is by and far thanks to the communication muck-ups going on in BT's chain of command than anything else. There is a very real scenario when you go through that combat operation that they lose more ships. They are exposed enough that they should lose more ships. They had tried a raid, they got caught. If it hadn't been for BT signaling all the ships to go and engage, well, sending a signal which could be interpreted as all the ships go and engage Blucher, rather than carrying on and engaging the rest of the first scouting group, he could have lost more than Blucher. But still, he was not there. He was not the one in command of that operation. He helped conceive and write it, but he'd done that under the pressure of the aggressive officers under his command and the high command demanding stuff. Not because he thought it was necessarily a good idea. And the honest thing is, Scheer believes that this operation with the loss of, that actually the loss of Blucher, that could have been an annihilation of a key British formation, that you could have had the High Seas Fleet waiting to pounce, i.e. do a Jutland, on this smaller portion of the Royal Navy. And, well, it's certainly an idea, but again, the idea is always to defeat a small portion of the Royal Navy, to attrit the Royal Navy in some way, so that they can find them on an equal footing, or a more equal footing. The real interesting thing to me in all the analysis that's going on at this point is how few of the German admirals think that the British get a vote, or rather rely on the British being shamelessly aggressive. Now, I would say in wartime you have had the example of the Battle of Coronel. You have seen a British commander acting in an aggressive manner that is probably should not have done. But there were reasons for him acting that way. And part of that was the whole weird command structure going on in the Admiralty at the time, and the issues which Churchill and others were causing in terms of their attempts to get rid of, and eventual success in getting rid of, well, an admiral who had gone to become Mountbatten, but of course at that time was called Battenberg. That was a whole other situation. But you can understand how, for the Germans, that confirmed their impression of the English, the British, being overly aggressive, doing such in a scenario. On the plus side of both engagements is that both sides presumed they were going to be finding just a single light cruiser to engage. So, at the Battle of Coronel, when they stumble into each other. And there's a very real scenario if the force at Coronel had been properly supplied with ships, and it hadn't been that wonderful plan put together by the Admiralty at that point, there is a very real chance that could have gone the other way, but it didn't. And then you get the Battle of the Falklands. But the thing is, for officers like Scheer, von Spee, bringing the enemy to such action, fighting so strongly, had set the timbre for how to deal with the British, that it was possible to use their aggression against them to kill them. And they were applying that to the whole fleet. They weren't analysing the individual commanders. They weren't looking at a differing situation on the ground fleet. They were applying it consistently across. And as such, senior officers like von Pohl, like Igenohl, who were more measured, let's say, were being discounted as being cowardly, cautious, weak. Which makes it very interesting when, of course, Scheer achieves command himself on the 18th of January 1916. Now, what he does when he gets command is he starts some exercises. Most importantly, he writes his guiding principles for sea warfare in the North Sea. And then he's helped out by some events, because his central premise, his idea, is that the Grand Fleet should be pressured, should be forced to come out and fight the High Seas Fleet, because of U-boats, because of Zeppelin raids, because of strategic fleet sorties and raids, and forcing them to try and abandon the distant blockade. So they have to come in for a close blockade to try and prevent these raids, so that the German fleet could then do what it had planned to do, so that the Kaisermarine... Basically, his whole tenet comes around to forcing the Royal Navy to do what he presumed the Royal Navy, what the German strategic thinking had presumed the Royal Navy would do anyway. And this is assisted by the forbidding of unrestricted submarine warfare that happens in April 1916. So now the Scheer has access to all the U-boats, all the submarines. He has access to them all. He has all these assets. But he has issues with that. He can't do anything till the sailors are repaired. He has trouble with the fact that 3rd Battle Squadron, his premier battle squadron, they have issues with their condensers, so they need them repaired. And honestly, when you read through his own account, and that's one of the good things, you can read his own account, which is obviously a contemporaneous account. Okay, I do appreciate that, because he writes this book and publishes it after World War One. And you can tell it's a contemporaneous account because he hasn't updated the stats of what was lost and what wasn't lost. He's left it in there. So he's left his notes accurate. He said, losses that are reserved for certain sunk was a ship of the Queen Elizabeth class. Name unknown. We, of course, know no Queen Elizabeth class was sunk. There wasn't. I'm sorry, I did recently read a conspiracy theory that it was actually HMS Agincourt, a sixth Queen Elizabeth, was sunk at this battle, and that's all being covered up by history. It hasn't been. There was no Queen Elizabeth class sunk at this battle. That HMS Agincourt wasn't completed. That is the thing that annoys me and Drac. Trust me. Trust me. If that thing had been completed, it would have solved so many of our debates. So it wasn't completed. He's quite right. A battlecruiser of the Invincible class. It's lost, yeah. 2 armor cruisers. He's got Black Prince and Defence as being lost. And a light cruiser, Shark. HMS Shark was a destroyer, but I'll leave that to one side. And another marked O-24. And he has a few things listed there. Now, he's even certain that HMS Acasta gets into serious issues. But when we start considering these things, Shark was lost at the Battle of Jutland. Shark was. Okay? No one would deny that. No one would get into this. The British actually lose 8 destroyers, 3 battle cruisers, and 3 armor cruisers at the Battle of Jutland. He hasn't modified his notes. And he would have known that by the time he publishes his account. By the time he does this, it would have been known. It would have been known. It was published in 1920. It was published with portrait plans by Castle and Company Limited in London, New York, Toronto, and Melbourne. In simple terms, it's probably written mostly in 1919, considering published or compiled in 1919. But the thing is, he hasn't changed it. He hasn't modified it. He hasn't done things to it to, make it fit. He has given you his contemporaneous thoughts. Which is one of the reasons why I feel we can use it as a good example of his thinking, because he hasn't added to it. He hasn't added to it. And therefore it is this source, this account of his own, which I have to admit I use often as my primary source when evaluating his leadership during the Battle of Jutland. I do bring in other sources. I've got not only his source up, but I've also got, of course, Massey's book here. I've got the various books written by various British admirals at the time. Some of them are contemporaneous. And it's worthwhile reading and analysing. It's worthwhile looking through. And they all talked to different people and got them in. But yeah, this is a battle of his creation. He has far more power over it than anyone else. He's the one who's setting the terms with the submarines. He's trying to factor in the scout assets. He's bringing the ships. He is conceiving and carrying this out as aggressively as he can. And the whole purpose of this, realistically, is to avenge Dogger Bank. And it's based on the idea of Dogger Bank. Which is one of the problems, this one. Because, of course, we know that the British have taken a battlecruiser squadron away from the battlecruiser fleet to go up for training with the Grand Fleet, and have replaced it with 5th Battle Squadron. Which means the battlecruiser formation is now very different. And whilst 1st Scouting Group might be able to go toe-to-toe with them under certain circumstances, 1st Scouting Group going toe-to-toe with the 5th Battle Squadron is not a good idea. In fact, as he writes, when he's talking about 5th Battle Squadron, when he's talking about their involvement in the battle and what they get up to, he literally phrases it as: superiority in firing and tactical advantages of position were decidedly on our side up to 6:19 p.m. when a new unit of 4 or 5 ships of the Queen Elizabeth type, with considerable surplus of speed, drew up from a northwesterly direction and began firing at ranges of 200 HM. That's 20,000 meters. 200 meters is what they, The German Navy, the Kaiserlich Marine at this point, works a lot in HM, 100 meters. Okay? Join the fighting. This made the situation critical for our cruisers. The new enemy fired with extraordinary rapidity and accuracy, with the greater ease as regards the latter that he met with almost no opposition, as our battlecruisers were fully engaged with Admiral Beatty's ships. At 6:20 p.m, the fighting distance between the battlecruisers on both sides was about 120 HM, or 12,000 meters, while between our battlecruisers and those with Queen Elizabeth, the distance was something like 180 HM, or 18,000 meters. At this stage, Torpedo Boat Flotilla 9 was the only one of the flotillas under the Chief of Reconnaissance that was in position to attack. The second leader of torpedo boats, Commodore Heinrich, on board the Regensburg, and some few boats belonging to Torpedo Flotilla 2, were getting up steam with all speed in a diagonal line from the Chief of Reconnaissance furthest point. They're trying to attack. They're trying to bring in the torpedo boats to defend that. It's worth noting that he does include an aside. According to English accounts, the 5th Battle Squadron comprised Barham, Warspite, Valiant, Malaya. Mention is made of 4 ships only. According to various observations on our side, by Squadron 3 and leader of Scouting Division 2, there were 5 ships. If Queen Elizabeth or a similar type of ship was not in the unit, it is possible that another recently built man-of-war replaced her. Note, the 5th Battle Squadron was comprised of the first 4 named ships. So he's added in notes after the war. And he's added in these notes, you take it himself. And it's a case of, there's some interesting discussions going on here. His reports were of 5 ships. And consistently you find this in the account. We presume it's just poor Jellicoe who's suffering from paucity of information. But honestly, Scheer is often suffering from information the other way. He's often getting too much information coming in, which isn't accurate. One is suffering from not enough information coming in, but it's usually accurate when it does arrive from the ships. When it arrives from the Admiralty, it's wrong. The other one is having issues with the information he's getting in. He's also having issues because his submarine line, which he'd put up around the various Royal Navy ports, hadn't worked. They'd been supposed to have tricked the British forces. They hadn't. And his reconnaissance information hasn't been coming in. Honestly, he's found himself in a situation he doesn't want to be. But anyway, he comes up and he's assisting them, and then, well, as I said, he joins the battle. He makes a decision. Oh, good, we've caught them, and we've caught more than we're thinking of, but we still, theoretically, we have enough. Theoretically, Beatty's force and this squadron, we can take down. In fact, it's even better. If we take this down, we've taken down their fastest ships and their critical new battleships. At this point, if we do that, we've won a major battle. There are 6 battle cruisers and 4 battleships. We take them out. That's a hefty amount of force gone from the British side. That's 10 ships. That's what he's been desiring this whole time, and boy does Scheer chase after it. Now, the Queen Elizabeth apparently forced Scouting Division 2 to withdraw, and the remaining torpedo flotillas to withdraw under the weight of their fire. And even though they tried to attack, they get blazed at by heavy caliber guns, is the phrasing, but it's probably 6-inch guns of the Queen Elizabeth. And then, well, and then he comes up with his own fleet and starts engaging. He brings up the full high seas fleet. He's brought them up, but there's a problem. And this was always a problem for the Germans in a way. Always a problem, this plan of annihilating, especially the battlecruiser fleet in forces. If you don't damage them so they can't run away, they run away. This is what he writes later on. The situation became critical for Scouting Division 1. Confronted as they were by 6 battlecruisers and 5 battleships. No, 4 battleships, not 5. There was only 4 there, but you know. Okay. Naturally, therefore, everything possible had to be done to get into touch with them, and a change was made back to a northerly course. The weather was extremely clear, the sky cloudless, and a light breeze from the northwest and a calm sea. At 06:30 hours, the fighting lines were sighted. At 06:45 hours, squadrons 1 and 3 opened fire, while the chief of reconnaissance, with forces allotted to him, placed himself at the head of the main fleet. The light enemy forces veered at once to the west, as soon as they were out of firing range, and turned northwards. Whether the fire from our warships damaged them during the short bombardment was doubtful, but their vague and purposeless hurrying to and fro led one to think that our fire had reached them, and that the action of our warships had so surprised them that they did not know what to do, which way to turn next. The English battlecruisers turned northwestly. Queen Elizabeth and the ships with her followed in their wake. Queen Elizabeth wasn't there, and thereby played the part of cover for the badly damaged cruisers. In so doing, however, they came very much nearer to our main fleet, and we came on at a firing distance of 17 kilometres or less. While both the English units passed by each other and provided mutual cover, Captain Max Schultz of the Chief of Torpedo Boat Flotilla 6 attacked at 6:49 p.m. with the 11th Torpedo Boat Half Flotilla. The result could not be seen. The fighting which now ensued developed into a stern chase. Our reconnaissance forces pressed on the heels of the enemy battlecruisers, and our main fleet gave chase to Queen Elizabeth and the ships with her. Our ships in Squadron 3 attained a speed of over 20 knots, which was also kept up on board the Kaiserin. Just before fire was opened, she had succeeded in repairing damage to one of her condensers. By the Frederick de Grosse, the fleet flagship 20 knots was achieved and maintained. In spite of this, the enemy battlecruisers succeeded soon after 7 o'clock in escaping from the fire of Scouting Division 1. The Queen Elizabeth and her sister ships also made such a good way that they were only under fire from the ships of the Scouting Division 1 and our 5th Division, the first half of Squadron 3. The hope that one of the ships pursued would be so damaged as to fall prey to our main fleet was not fulfilled. Although our firing was effective, and at 7:30 p.m. it was seen that a ship of the Queen Elizabeth type, after she'd been hit repeatedly, drew slowly out of the fighting line with a heavy list to leeward. Now that's an interesting one. Now, we know Malaya takes heavy damage in this fight, but she doesn't pull out a line. The only ship which pulls out a line is Warspite later on, when she gets her steering cut and does a full sort of circuit, does donuts in front of the High Seas fleet. But that's later, when the fleets are converging, and HMS Warrior thinks they are protecting her. Which is nice of them. They presume that she's actually just being Warspite. But it's rather interesting in this scenario. We're hearing this account, and we have lots of accounts of the battle putting together, but this is considered a very authoritative account for its time, and yet he's getting quite a lot which we know is not quite the way it was. But it's his perception of the battle at the time. And that's the important. That starts to feed into his analysis. He thinks he's beating them. He thinks he's starting to damage the Queen Elizabeth. He thinks he can take them out. And remember, that's been his aim from the beginning of the war. That's been what he's wanted to do. So it starts to add up to a scenario you can understand. And then we get the scenario which, frankly, they had been dreading. The entire arc, stretched from north to east, was a sea of fire. The flash from the muzzles of guns was distinctly seen through the mist and smoke on the horizon, though the ships themselves were not distinguishable. This was the beginning of the main phase of the battle. There was never any question of our line veering round to avoid encounter. The resolve to do battle with the enemy stood firm from the first. The leaders of our battleship squadrons, the 5th Division, turned at once to a running fight, carried on at about 13,000 metres. The other divisions followed the movement on orders signalled from the flagship. By this time, more than 100 heavy guns had joined in the fight on the enemy's side, directed fire chiefly at our battle cruisers and the ships of the 5th Division, the Koenig class. That must have been a sight. The whole time he's been running north, he hasn't once considered it would seem from these notes, and honestly, he never seems to think. He's always constantly reading that the British are scattering, the British are running and chasing them. At no point does he think the British have turned his own plan on him. That his plan of drawing using the battle cruisers, the first gunning group, to draw the battle cruiser fleet into the waiting a warm embrace of the high seas fleet, had been turned to using the battle cruiser fleet to draw the high seas fleet into the warm embrace of the Grand Fleet. Probably because he's presuming he'll be told. There's got to be information. There's submarines, there's all sorts of things he's had trying to find out information. But he hasn't got it. He hasn't got it. And so, he's in this scenario. And, yes, he can talk about their bravery. There was no desire to veer away. We weren't going to run. We would fight. But it's kind of silly. Honestly, it's the unthinking aggression, almost, that he was relying on the British facing to be attrited by him the German fleet, close to the German coast. It's not sensible. You're facing an overwhelming superiority of force, which he does admit afterwards, and that's one of the reasons why he becomes the biggest proponent of submarine warfare, because he does realise its overwhelming mass. He then has a whole discussion about what to do. And it's an interesting discussion because he sort of says, I could see nothing of our cruisers, which were still farther forward. Owing to the turning aside that was inevitable in the drawing nearer, they found themselves between the fire of both lines. For this reason, I decided to turn our line and bring it onto an opposite course. Otherwise, an awkward situation would have arisen round the pivot which the enemy line by degrees was passing. As long distance shots from the enemy would certainly have hit our rear ships. As regards the effectiveness of the artillery, the enemy was more favourably situated, and as our ships stood out against the clear western horizon, where his own ships were hidden by smoke and mist of battle. A running artillery fight on a southerly course would therefore not have been advantageous to us. The swing round was carried out in an excellent style, and our peace manoeuvres, great importance was always attached to their being carried out on a curved line, and every means employed to ensure the working of the signals. The trouble spent was now well repaid. The cruisers were liberated from their cramped position and able to steam away south and appeared as soon as the two lines were separated, in view of the flagship. Torpedo boats, too, on leeward side of the fire, had room to manoeuvre and attack. It's a good manoeuvre. It is a good and well-deployed manoeuvre. Scheer has got what he wanted. He's got the engagement which he's been critical of Igenohl and von Pohl for not getting. He's got the engagement. He's got the battle. The trouble is, has he got the forces to win it? Has he got the forces to really take the battle to them? Now the battle carries on, and he's forced to do the turn again. But this time, remember I explained the turn, it's supposed to be the last ship first that turns and then it ripples down the line? It's actually the second turn, something different happens. At 9:17 p.m, therefore, the line was again, for the third time, swung round on a westerly course, and this was carried out at a moment when the flagship Frederick Gross was taking a southerly course by the turning point. Although the signal to swing round hung on the starboard side and was being carried out by neighbouring ships, I made the chief of the Frederick de Gross carry out the turn to larboard on the port. This might have led the ships following behind to think there was a mistake in signalling, but my intention to get through and save the ships in front of the Frederick de Gross from a difficult situation in carrying out the manoeuvre was rightly understood by Vice Admiral Erhard Schmidt in the Ostfriesland, the leader of Squadron 1. He did not wait, therefore, for the carrying out of the movement from the rear, which is the general rule to avoid all danger of collision, but himself gave the lead in turning of his squadron by starting the turn to starboard of Friesland, and thus forced his ship round. This action was a very satisfactory proof of the capable handling of the ships and the leader's intelligence grasps on the situation. It is good. He does have good commanders who have been paying more attention to the reality of it than other things. Now, he does make an interesting point in his next paragraph, which I do want to bring up. After the change to course west fleet, we was brought round to southwesterly suddenly, and finally to southeasterly course to meet the enemy's encircling movement and keep our open way for our return. The enemy fire ceased very soon after we had swung round, and we lost sight of adversary. The enemy's casualties at this stage of the fighting cannot be given. Expecting the effects of direct hits, which we were able to confirm from the flames of explosion, the enemy has only emitted the damage to Marlborough by torpedoes. Although Admiral Jellicoe admits that torpedoes reached his line, but claims to have escaped further damage by clever handling of his ships. Our assumption that he had already turned back before the attack by torpedoes is thus confirmed. On our side, all the ships were in condition to keep up the speed requisite for night work, 16 knots, and thus keep their pace in line. There's some iffiness with that timeline, and I'm not too keen on doing there being a personal added attack to notes on Admiral Jellicoe. I find that a little bit okay, because when you look at the timelines of the two by the standard, it does sort of, how do I put this? Scheer seems to consistently underestimate how long it takes for his ships to deliver on his orders. And this means he takes the timeline and he goes, they've already turned before they launch. And sometimes they haven't. I would also say that because of the standing orders for the Grand Fleet, which is again something interesting, both fleets have their own standing orders, but Scheer never seems to bother to read them after the war, which would have been interesting to hear what his thoughts would have been on the Grand Fleet standing orders, but he doesn't seem to go and read them or write down his thoughts if he does, which is a shame, because he writes down his thoughts on everything else, so I'd presume if he had read them, he would have written down his thoughts on them. Does include rules for how to deal with torpedo attack, and how to comb it, basically. Which is what the Grand Fleet did. And then we have the night battles and the decision to fight through at night and his thinking. And it's very much a case of, we have to survive. He thinks he's done a lot more damage than he has in some ways, but less damage than he actually has in other ways. He's far more certain he's sunk battleships when actually he's sunk battle cruisers, but leave that to one side. And of course, after all this, he decides to make for Horn's Reef. Decides to get home by the safest way possible, he decides. And he does it. There's a night fight. That's a menacing exchange. And again, to an extent, he has an advantage in this, in that, well, neither side is very good at fighting at night at this point in history. Please, there are all sorts of people who claim things about forces being capable of fighting at night. The forces which are capable of fighting at night, realistically at this point, are a group of Royal Navy destroyers and light cruisers called the Harwich Force, and the German destroyer, well, torpedo boat vessels, which are based mostly as counterparts to the Harwich Force along down in the coast, on the coast of Belgium in the Netherlands area. Those forces are the ones which are fighting at night on a regular basis and are actually well trained and experienced in it. Everyone else is reading off a manual and has done maybe 1 or 2 exercises in the life expectancy of that crew. And when I say exercises, I mean realistic exercises rather than running the drills in the dark and going, yes, we can fight at night. There is a difference between the two. So yes, what turns into an absolute messy night fight, and any claims of control of that by anyone is grossly overstated. Grossly overstated. But they managed to get home. And the trouble is, the Royal Navy thought they were going in a different direction. But they managed to get home. They managed to get away, and yes, he gives the list of losses on both sides. For the British, he decided it was a dreadnought of the Queen Elizabeth class, which we know wasn't lost. Battle cruisers, Queen Mary, Indefatigable and Invincible. Armoured cruisers, Black Prince, Defence Warrior, and one of the Cressy type. Again, not at this battle. 2 light cruisers, 13 destroyers. He claims 23 ships, 169,200 tons of vessels sunk. But he did add notes next to that list of next to the dreadnought of the Queen Elizabeth class. Ships of the class were damaged. He writes down that the battle cruisers 3 they were confirmed. It was Queen Mary, Indefatigable and Invincible. He writes down next to the cruisers it was actually just Black Prince, Defence and Warrior. And the destroyers 8, and he even lists them: Ardent, Fortune, Nestor, Normand, Shark, Sparrowhawk, Turbulent and Tipperary sunk. So he claimed 23 after the battle from the observations of everyone, but he actually sunk 14. In terms of ships lost himself, well, he of course has the advantage of being 100% correct on that because he was in command of them. The Lutzow, the Pommern, so that's a battle cruiser, and all this, an order type battleship, 4 light cruisers, the Wiesbaden, Elbing, Rostock and Frondwolb, 5 torpedo boats for 11 vessels in total, and they are all confirmed. But again, rather like he listed the destroyers, he gives us a list of the names, or rather the designations, of the torpedo boats lost. The S-35, the V-4, the V-27, the V-29 and the V-48. Which I rather like, and I think comes from his own experience of working with them. The fact that he still thinks they're worthwhile crediting and talking about. He then gets into a whole section, I would have to say, in his account, where he's basically comparing the official published account and published version of Jellicoe's account with his own account. And getting into discussion and debating, and it's interesting to read. It is an interesting thought process. And listening to the two discuss, I think both overestimated how many of each other's they killed. Both did. And one of the interesting things I find is that in both cases they tried to put themselves in to extent in the other's minds and figured out sort of what the other would do, but come with different methodologies of doing it. Because he'd gone for Hornreef, and Jellicoe had headed off for another position which he thought was where the Germans would be trying to get in through the minefield. And I do love the discussion of, well, there were fights of us during the night, so surely that would have revealed our position to the Grand Fleet and told everyone what was going on. It doesn't always work like that. Because, as I said, there was discussions of whether they were blue on blue, there was whole debates, and the information spread over such a large area that it doesn't necessarily reveal itself till the morning, by which time you're in the wrong position, and you're scrambling to try and get back. But life happens, and these things were all sorted out in the end, and it happened as it did. It happened as it did. And then there's the full analysis of his after the battle reports and all the discussions. And the thing you get is that Scheer is an incredibly smart man. Scheer is an incredibly smart man. But and I say this as a big glutamus maximus on this whole discussion, even when after this battle he shifts over to a focus on submarine warfare to try and attrit the British efforts and energies, he's backing up Holzendorff. In some ways, he's moved from the Tirpitz camp to the Holzendorff camp, now that Holzendorff has moved to that camp. And again, you get the impression that this is a man who has some good leadership potential and some good decision making, but who doesn't possibly come up with the stuff himself. In terms of he's a very good analyst and probably a good leader when it comes down to it. And I'm going to say he's probably a good leader. He makes decisions and he makes them fast when he needs to, which is a good way of saving lives. And being prepared to take a risk to save your personnel's lives is always going to earn you good points in my leadership book. But I very much get the fact that when it comes to conceiving and theorizing about what his fleet should do, to try and work out how to best use it, he is more an articulator of the visions and ideas of others than an originator of the ideas himself in the way it works. And don't take that as necessarily a massive critique, because you need people like that. Not everyone can sit there going off into the theory land and going, right then, so if we do this and this and this. Some people are just too grounded that they can't detach themselves enough from what's happening around them to try and think that far, to try and think that out. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's something to think about as a leader. I'd also say that in some regards, Scheer seems to turn these things into personal animosities. His views on von Pohl and Igenohl become personal. His views on Jellicoe are personal. Even though he does do quite personal attacks on them, and they never really get into that. They never really do. And that is again something which I find interesting. But when he dies in 1928, there is a recognition that they've lost someone of importance, someone of value, someone who has served the Navy, has served the nation. And he did. He'd done his best to suppress mutinies, to write his memoirs, to try and help the world, as he viewed it, as well as his nation. He was also devastated in 1920. An intruder broke into his house and murdered his wife, his maid, and injured his daughter. And it's why, while he's in that solitude of, I would say, fear and upset and horror, that he writes Von Schigelschiff zum U-Boot, From Sailing Ship to Submarine, which was his autobiography, published in 1925. What's really sad is that he was supposed to meet Jellicoe in 1928, but he died before he could. Jellicoe actually invited him to meet him, to come see him in England. And Scheer was apparently looking forward to it. So one of the few times Scheer was going to be out, had left his home, was not in solitude, was actually going to meet Jellicoe. And that, to me, suggests that some of the personal animosity that was featured in his earlier writings was part of the propaganda battle, and part of the discussions of that. And again, there is a realization that wartime publications of reports and journals, they have a dose of propaganda in them. And it's one of the things you have to consider is when they're talking about the losses of each side and what their opponent lost, there is a healthy dose of propaganda in that. You always have to consider it. While a war is going on, and I can say this with knowledge of what I've got coming up, I've got a discussion coming up at some point of lessons of Ukraine, have they erased the lessons of the Falklands War, for a Patreon video. And it's very much, well, to an extent, we can't be certain about this because there's still a lot of propaganda going on. But there are some things we can broadly take that come out of the propaganda. So one of the interesting things is that sometimes the propaganda on both sides, the things they agree on happening in their propaganda from both sides, usually point to some nuggets of truth that we can learn some lessons of. We can receive get some ongoing, what I would call situational analysis with a reasonable degree of accuracy, without having secret sources, without having confidential informants going on. His daughter Marianne christened the Admiral Scheer, which was funded and launched funded during the Weimar Republic and launched in 1933, named for him. And honestly, he deserved that. He deserved the ship to be named for him. He did his best. Now, at this point, I normally come up with a question for you all. A discussion to put forward and for you to think through and hopefully find interesting. And I'm not going to disappoint, I've got one. I've got one for Admiral Scheer. And it's an interesting one to me, because Scheer's a thinking officer. He's not an originator of theories, but he is an enactor of them. So here's a question. If Scheer is given control of the High Seas Fleet from the beginning of the war. Unlike the situation he finds himself in where he's running a battle squadron within the fleet under Igenohl and then von Pohl, what do you think happens? What do you think Scheer does earlier in the war? Because there is an interesting point. If you consider before 1916, there are points, 1914, 1915, where the Germans don't necessarily have an advantage, but would perhaps have something of a better positioning because of where the British are spread out around the world. There is the simple matter that at Jutland, during the Battle of Jutland, then the ships which are sitting off screen for the Royal Navy account for more vessels than are lost, and the ships that are readily coming into service not that long down the road from the R class and from renowned repulsect are again not that far away. So for the Royal Navy, whilst they prefer not to lose anything, they're able to make up. But it wasn't always like that. If you look at the period it takes those ships to do and the pauses and the issues that come with, there were times when it could have had there could have been a very different situation for the Royal Navy should they have lost 3 battle cruisers. So what happens if Scheer is in charge from the beginning? What do we think he does? What is he able to do? Because a key part of his plan for Jutland involved the submarines, and you have a lot more submarines available in May, June 1916 than you do later on. A lot more submarines available in May, June 1916 than you do later on. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And take care. What have we got coming up? Well, next week it's going to be Tsushima. That's going to be a fun battle to look at. The leader, the logistics, learning, and application of Battle of Tsushima. And then the Battle of Jutland, a strategy of leadership, is going to be the 27th. That should be a fun one. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care. I just saw a flash, I swear, on that screen. It's one of these light bulbs playing up. Which one is it? Or is it a circuit? Fun times.